Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to ReachIvy's webinar series, Know Your Top Colleges. About ReachIvy. ReachIvy is a premium education and careers advisory. Over the last 6 years, we've established a strong presence among distinguished leaders in the education space. We have successful admits across schools globally, from INSEAD and LSE to Harvard, Columbia, and Stanford. And we've been featured in Business World, The Economic Times, Education World, and more. Some of our services include counseling, college selection, essay editing and applications, interview prep, resume prep, LinkedIn review, etc. A little bit about me. I'm Aparna Maroo Jain. I'm a senior counselor at ReachIvy. I've lived across India, Dubai, and London. I've worked with Deloitte in London and been an entrepreneur in India and spent several years in learning and development with several corporate investment banks and the Big Four. Today, we're going to be talking about how to get a head start on your letter of recommendation. So, I'm just going to go through a few things that are critical in making sure that you've targeted this properly. So, we're going to talk about how to get a head start on your letter of recommendation. So, why is your letter of recommendation so important anyway? Actually, it's actually as important as your application, as important as your GMAT scores, and so on. So, we're going to try and figure out what the best way around this is. When should you prepare for this? Whom should you ask? And when is the right time to start this process? What brief should you give your recommender? And then, of course, the what to include and what definitely not to include. So, this is quite a lot that we're going to go through. If at the end of it you've got any questions, just as I'm talking, keep putting your questions up on YouTube and I'll answer all your questions at the end. So, why is your letter of recommendation so important? Actually, if you look at it, it is a third of your application. It actually tells your potential colleges what your test scores and essays don't. Okay, because it tells them what other people think of you, how they perceive you, how you've come across to them when you've worked with things with other people. How has that gone? What have been your greatest strengths and weaknesses? And the whole idea is that it's almost like a third party endorsement of what you're saying. Okay, so your letter of recommendation is actually a secret space for you to be able to showcase stuff about yourself when you're bursting with that 500 word limit or 700 or 300 word limit on some of your essays. Okay, so extremely integral. Now, in our experience, most people tend to scramble with their letters of recommendation at the very end. So, as they're doing their application, suddenly people will be like, oh, so I've spoken to XYZ and they are going to give me a recommendation. And then the next question that we ask them is, well, are they, have you asked them, what kind of things they might talk about, or have you reminded them of the things you've done with them? And the response is usually, no, they know. Okay, but the thing is, whilst all your recommenders are likely to be extremely well intentioned and they really do want you to get through to the colleges of your choice, the fact is that they are busy people as well. Okay, so the best time to do this is when you start thinking about applying to college. Start speaking to people who you think might be able to provide good recommendations for you. And the key is to get to them well in advance so that you have a sense of where they're at with it, and they have a sense of why you want to do what you want to do. You have a chance to remind them of some of the things you've done, and also remember there will be other people that are going to want the same as you. So it's best to get to your recommenders before they get completely inundated with requests by everyone else. Okay, so really the earlier the better. Big question here, whom to ask? Okay, so if you're applying at the undergraduate level, the natural sort of go-to is your school professors or your school teachers. A lot of times they say they want academic referees, non-academic referees, as well as someone who may know you in a different context. Now, your letter of recommendation, like I said, is a secret chance at showcasing stories about you that you may not have your form to do, to showcase that side of you. So try and look for people that can tell different stories about you. For example, if you're applying at undergraduate level and you spent, a summer volunteering at a community college, or doing something, maybe mountain climbing somewhere, try and get someone who headed that to speak about you, because they will be able to capture those character and personality traits which make you stand out. Okay, your academic referees, on the other hand, will be able to capture other parts of you. So make sure you've thought about this very, very clearly, and almost look at why you want each person to be doing it. Now, if you're applying for graduate school, then it may be that your college professors were 5 or 6 years ago. Okay, in which case, if you do need to get an academic referee, the earlier you get to them, the better, because you need to reinvest into that relationship, build it up again, remind them of what you did, and so on. Okay, and chances are it's going to take a little bit longer. When you're applying for graduate programs, the other obvious choice is, of course, your work colleagues and supervisors. Now, here there's a few things that you must bear in mind. A lot of people seem to think that just because someone is CEO of a very fancy corporation, they're the best person to ask, because it's just going to look great. Well, yeah, it'll look great, but how much is that person going to actually say about you? So there is a rule of thumb. The recommendation needs to be about you, from somebody who knows you. So even if it is somebody who's just 1 or 2 levels up, if they're able to provide that very, very insightful information about what you did and how you did it, that's much, much more valuable than somebody who's just got a fancy title. So wherever possible, make sure you're going with someone who can genuinely back you up. So in some cases, sometimes you're looking at providing additional letters of recommendation from people with fancy titles that may have potentially been to the same school. As long as you know that's an additional backup, that's fine. But for your main letter of recommendation, it needs to be from someone that knows you closely, has worked with you, is able to comment on how you did, is able to share stories about what you did, and so on. The other thing is also that if you have a choice between someone who's known you for 3 or 4 years versus someone who's just known you for a year, you may well want to go with someone who's known you for 3 or 4 years, because that person, again, is, the gravitas of what they have to say is going to be much more than someone who's just known you for a year and comes up with generic sounding things to say about you. Okay, when people are often running their own businesses and want to apply to graduate school, a big thing is, well, everyone's within the family, or it's I'm the boss, so people are going to say good things about me. How's a college going to view that? Well, the thing to do is to try and again get different perspectives. Okay, so it's great if you can get maybe a client to speak and say that they've worked with you for X many years, and this is how responsive you were, and so on and so forth. Or perhaps even get a stakeholder, or just get somebody that you've been professionally involved with, or maybe an industry body or something. Okay, so you get the idea. The bottom line is, okay, that it needs to be someone who's going to be very, very enthusiastic about recommending you. It doesn't like I said, have to be someone who's very high up or extremely important. It just needs to be someone who's going to be genuine about saying that I know X person, he's great or she's great, and this is why I think they're so great. Okay, so that is about whom to ask. So we've said we should start the process early, but how should you start the process? Okay, I mean, of course, you first have the introductory email or phone call when you ask them, well, what context, can you do the recommendation for me, and so on. But the next thing is that once they've agreed to do it, you need to try and brief them on the kind of context that they can write about. So, for example, try and think of 2 or 3 stories and achievements that you've had, and try and tell them that, hey, I was thinking this happened when we worked together. What do you think? Is this something that you'd like to talk about? Or this happened? And you need to do this to rejig their memory, because like I said, in some cases, of course, it may be on the top of their heads. But in other cases, with the very best of intentions, the fact is that um, these things need reminding. So think about all this just as much as you think about what you're going to put down on your essays. So when you're making your list of stories, separate them out. Okay, your letter recommendation is almost like valuable real estate which you want to optimize. So segregate the stories that your recommenders can use and sort of put them aside. So I'm not saying you influence your recommenders, but in case they need help in terms of remembering what kind of projects you were involved with, then these are great. Okay, and finally, send them a copy of your latest resume. It's good for them to be able to get an idea of what your career path has been, where your motivations lie, because it helps them visualize you in entirety. Okay, and most important, do follow up and check if they need more details, because this is about you. It is in your interest that they have everything that they need. So don't be shy. Just make sure you follow up and check if they need more details. Okay, what else do they need to know? So you remind them of, the instances you work together and so on. Is there anything else they need to know? Well, yes, it would be very helpful if you shared your goals with them, your short-term goals, your long-term goals, the ones that you're going with, when you apply to colleges, whether they're niche, whether they're in line with what you've done or whatever it is, because it helps them relate back. So if there's been an incident where you've, for example, you've been very interested in healthcare and that is your long-term goal, and you had that project that you worked on, then they're able to say that, he worked with me on this project and he displayed a lot of enthusiasm in terms of finding out more about the sector. And I think this ties in really well with his long term goal. Okay, so it's very relevant when you share all of these things with them. And the idea is to be as proactive as you can so that people are able to support you on this. Okay, they need to know specific incidents outside of the shared work history with them that you're proud of. So, for example, if say you worked with somebody 3 or 4 years ago, and then subsequently you've gone on to head a prestigious team or win an award or something, share that with them too, which hopefully they will get from your resume, but tell them about it, because again, it just gives them the whole picture. And the other thing is, your failures are just as important, if not more, than your successes are. So share your failures too, and what you learn from them, because it helps them build this other side of you and talk about you, and possibly even be able to say that he failed, but when I sort of gave him all of this input, this is what he went and did, or she went and did, and here's someone who's learned from it. So that's why it's integral for them to know all of these things. Okay, so very often we get asked, so what should the letter of recommendation have? It's very simple. A letter of recommendation cannot be cookie cutter. Okay, so it needs to be authentic. It needs to display who you are as a person. So it cannot be fancy words woven together to say, she's the most hardworking, conscientious, brilliant, excellent communicator, blah 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 side. And this is why you should definitely take her on. It needs to be authentic. It needs to talk about a real person. Okay, so let the letter recommendation showcase that human side of you, which is what's going to come through with these stories. Okay, so the stories, of course, need to showcase the different side of you. So for example, if you worked on a project and there's two stories, right? There may be one where the whole team worked really hard at getting more business out of a client, and you've used that in your essay already. Use another one. Use one that talks about the fact that the whole team came together and there was a failure. However, this is how you responded to it. This is how you grew. This is how you handled it. And subsequently, when something else came up, this is how you took it. Okay. It goes without saying that the letter of recommendation needs to be professionally written. What does that mean? That just means that it cannot be in a casual kind of sense where it's talking about you as somebody who's a friend. It needs to be professionally written. Okay. And where you're talking about areas of weakness, or where your recommenders are talking about areas of weakness, ideally they should be supplemented with evidence of how you've grown. So, for example, if an area of weakness has been that you find it very difficult to integrate in larger groups, then ideally it should be followed up with, well, how what the progress has been. So whether there's been a little progress, whether there's been a lot of progress, your recommender could possibly talk about how you took the feedback, and have you gone and solicited further feedback? Is this something you've been conscientiously working on? Colleges want to see all of that. They want to look at not just, it's not a balance sheet that they want to look at. They want to look at the continuous process that you've gone through. So don't be afraid to showcase that. And that's something that should definitely be on your letter recommendation. So have nots, okay? We've talked about this a little bit. We need to make sure that the letter recommendation does not have the same stories as your essays. Okay, the purpose behind this is almost, I'm going to give you an analogy. If you have 1,000 square foot flat, would you build 2 kitchens into it? Absolutely not. I mean, if I had a mansion, maybe, but in 1,000 square foot flat, absolutely not. So your application form is a little bit like valuable real estate, where your essays are possibly 500 words and your letter recommendation is another 500 words. So make sure that you treat it like that. Okay, so use it to showcase other aspects that haven't come through on your form. The other thing that a lot of people tend to have trouble with is that they will have a lot of adjectives that describe them. So your recommenders, and this is especially when recommendations are rushed at the end, and your recommenders, despite the best intentions, just haven't got time to flesh out those stories. So it tends to be just, she communicates really well, she led the team very well, and she was great, blah, blah, blah. But that's not the same. Okay, so if it's just that, it's very empty. So until it doesn't have a story that backs it up, it really doesn't have that impact. Okay, so make sure that everything on your letter of recommendation has a story that follows it up. And finally, a lot of times, people will get letters of recommendation, and they will be very gushing. They will almost talk about, about candidates in the absolute terms. So she was the best person that I've sort of come across, or I've never seen somebody in her peer group who's dealt with this issue in this kind of sense, which is fine, okay, if that's what you really were. But remember, we want to maintain the authenticity. We want to maintain, the whole genuine spirit of it. So tell your recommender, if you really think that I contributed so significantly, it may help if you just said she was in the top 5%, or, on a scale of X to Y, this is how she stood out, or she stood out because she did all of these extra things. Okay, so instead of going with the most brilliant or the most amazing person, etc., try and back it up with other things like that. Okay, so in summary, I cannot say this enough, but you do need to begin well in advance. You need to start planning it. You need to be engaging with your recommenders, whether they're academic, non-academic. It could be colleagues, it could be people you've run marathons with. But the idea is to be proactive so that they know where you're coming from. They know what your hopes, your dreams, your plans are, and they can help you with them. You need to prepare for them just as much as you prepare for your essays. So when you sit down and make that bucket list of everything you do, try and segregate that these are the ones I'm talking about. And because my recommender had an overview or a good overview of what happened on this incident, they'd be able to back it up as well. So make sure you do that whole bucket list and then segregate it as well as you can. And finally, keep it real. Okay? It needs to be about you. Colleges don't want cookie cutter profiles. They want people that enhance the diversity. They want people that can add to classrooms, to institutions, and that's why they want people that have amazing stories, whether they're successes, failures, learnings, or anything. Okay, so make sure this is about you. Make sure you tell your recommender that you want this to be about you, and that is very, very important. So, if how relevant is startup experience is a very good question that someone's actually put up. Do the application and reviewers hold it in high regard? Okay, so startup experience is actually extremely important. Um, it showcases how resilient you are. It showcases the fact that you've gone through this whole journey of having to do it yourself and so on. So don't undermine the startup experience at all, because very often, especially where there's a failure, a lot of people are, do tend to be a bit shy to talk about startup experience. But don't be. Okay, make sure you talk about all the different things you did, and try and get people to validate. So if there are people that you're using for your recommendations, try and get them to validate the the characteristics that you displayed during that. Whether the application reviewers hold it in high regard, well, it's as much as anything else. Okay, if everyone from your class went and started, a startup, then it may not be such a big thing. However, if, for example, you went and started this niche startup in the area of possibly, uh, you know, measuring primary school education effectiveness, and came up with this whole tool. It's all of that which also matters. So don't just don't undermine it, or don't underplay it. It is definitely relevant, but I think the question you need to ask yourself is this something I would use on my stories, for my essays? If it is, then it definitely merits a place on your recommendations too. So I don't think we have any other questions now. If you do have questions, do send us an email on our ReachIvy email address. And yes, so that's it for me. Thank you very much for signing in to watch this webinar, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.